Hi guys, welcome to this revision session on London by William Blake, one of your 15 poems from the Power and Conflict cluster. The first thing we're going to look at is who exactly is William Blake. Now, this comes under your AO3 if you can discuss who William Blake was, but you need to be able to link these ideas to the task. Okay, so to get to at least level 3 and above, you need to be making links between everything that's on this slide and the poem, and discuss why did William Blake write the poem in the first place. So the first thing that is really important to note is that he was a controversial and rebellious figure in his time. One of the reasons for that is he respected religion but was very critical towards any form of organised religion. So churches, he was extremely critical towards just because they were organised. Now, Blake was influenced by the ideals of Enlightenment and the French Revolution. So you'll see on the slide in the green box are the 5 steps of Enlightenment. Now, the first one is reason. Blake was influenced by this idea that truth could be discovered through reason and logical thinking. Therefore, there was no room for God or religion in this logical thinking. Everything natural is considered to be good and reasonable. And people from the Enlightenment era believe that if you live by nature's laws, you'll find happiness. So you will not find happiness in worshipping God. Also believe that with a scientific approach, society can be perfected. So you've got this idea of the science versus religion debate. And then finally, that through reason and logical thinking, society can be set free. So that is your liberty point. So this idea that religion shackles you, you are trapped by religion if you follow organised religion. The second thing that Blake was influenced by was the French Revolution. And again, you'll see in the blue box, there's just a couple of points about the French Revolution. If you're interested in the French Revolution, there's lots and lots of reading resources online for you to have a look at. The first thing is that the French Revolution was a movement of radical hope for William Blake, and he did wear a bonnet rouge for solidarity. Now, the cap that Blake wore around the streets of London symbolised freedom from tyranny. So in this case, it could be freedom from religion, freedom from the shackles that the government impose on the poor people. Now, what does the poem actually mean? What's going on in the poem? So in the poem, there's 4 stanzas, and it depicts the dark underbelly of the 18th century London. It's growing, the city is growing, London's growing due to the Industrial Revolution. Lots of people are fleeing to London to work in the factories. However, whilst there was this positive side of the factories growing and the city that was bustling, it had a very, very dark side. Sexual diseases were spreading from prostitutes, child labour was happening, lots of people were dying, and the institution of marriage turned into something shambolic, so it no longer meant anything. And that's what our poem is discussing, the dark underbelly of London in the 18th century. Now, there's lots of different attitudes in our poem. The first one being anger, second one being hopelessness, and the third one being pessimism. So in terms of anger, Blake is extremely angry. He's angry that the people won't break free of their mind-forged manacles. He's angry that the government and the church and the monarchy, people that are supposed to be looking after you, are actually causing more harm than good. They're looking after themselves. They're chartering for their own benefits rather than for the benefits of the poor people. Bringing up onto number 2, this hopelessness, the hopelessness of the poor people, the hopelessness of the never-ending cycle of suffering in the poem. The fact that the youthful harlots pass on their diseases to the children, so the children are brought up in this never-ending cycle of misery. And this idea of pessimism, that this isn't going to change because these people, the normal people of London, just do not have the power, do not have the oomph to change anything. So your key quotation for this could be mind-forged manacles, that metaphor there. This idea that people of London are permanently changed to their disadvantaged situations. These chains that are imposed are by the external agencies, the church, the monarchy and the government, and they strip away all freedom from the people of London. Everybody is restricted in some way, including the soldier, which is really, really important. A soldier that we consider to be very strong, looks after our country. Even the soldiers are restricted. However, Blake does get frustrated. He is angry because the individual carries some responsibility for his own liberation. So people make their own chains, and if we refuse to open our minds, we cannot break free of those chains. So whilst he accepts that the government are putting these mind-forged manacles and imposing these manacles onto the people of London, Blake is frustrated that those people cannot break free of those chains. They've got no intention to break free of those chains. So who is the narrator of London? It's a first-person narrator, so some could argue that it is a dramatic monologue. It's just one person walking through the streets of London, showing us as a reader the relentless images of suffering that he sees on the street, uncovers who he believes is responsible. So as we've said, we've got the blood runs down palace walls, you've got the hapless soldier's sigh at the blackening church. He believes that the church, the monarchy and the government are responsible for all of the relentless images of suffering, and he believes that walking through the streets, this narrator believes that nothing pure remains. Like I said before, even the soldiers are hapless, the children are crying, the children are infected by the prostitutes, suggesting that nothing pure remains on the streets of London anymore. So just a couple of key quotations. These all have the same theme of suffering. So the first one being marks of weakness, marks of woe. So really obvious things that you could pick out are the repetition of marks, suggesting that these people are scarred and damaged by those in authority. So marks of weakness, marks of woe suggest that they have got physical marks. They are physically scarred by those in authority. But they're marks of weakness, marks of woe. So it could also be mental marks that they have experienced. Suggesting that those in authority are not looking after the poorer people in London, and that those in authority only change the laws to benefit the wealthy. So the fact that the streets have become chartered, that makes those on the streets weak. It brings them woe because none of the laws are there to benefit them. Therefore, emphasising this idea of suffering, both mentally and physically. You can see the physical marks. You can also see the signs of woe. You've also got the anaphora of in every. So this idea that in every, lots and lots and lots of people are suffering because of the laws that have been changed to benefit the wealthy. Anaphora is where the line is repeated. So if you look in the second stanza starts in every and every and every, suggesting that we ignore that the whole of society is suffering together. They are trapped, they're repressed, they're controlled. Everybody, apart from the blackening church and the palace, are suffering in some way because of the laws that have been changed. You've also got this verb cry that is repeated throughout the poem. Now, this reminds the reader of the discontent and the misery that the narrator hears when he's walking around London. It also emphasises the fact that the misery and suffering is experienced by all. So you could link the verb cry with the anaphora of in every to suggest how many people are suffering in the world and in London. You've also then got this idea of a chimney sweep. Here is a very, very obvious direct reference to child labour, and it illustrates the violation and the injustice of child labour. So the chimney sweep works at the blackening church, suggesting that the blackening church is supposed to be there to protect those children. The church is supposed to be there as a figure of safety. However, we're exploiting those children. The church are using them for their labour, which would increase the amount of child deaths that are being experienced in London at the time, suggesting that the church is not there to protect the children. The church is there to exploit them for all they're worth. Carrying on then, you've got newborn infant's tear and youthful harlot's curse. Remember, a harlot is a prostitute, so we've got a young prostitute. Both of these quotations show that there is no innocence or purity left in London. This idea that the lower class women are exposed for the benefits of the upper class people, and those youthful harlots end up with diseases that they pass on to their newborn children. those young people have got no rights at all, and they're forced to sell their bodies for money so they can get money to support their families and support this newborn infant. But the fact that the youthful harlots and the chimney sweepers, they've got no rights. They need to do whatever they can to support their families and to bring income to their families. Again, linking to this idea that the church and the government are exploiting them. This also links to this continual cycle of suffering. STIs are passed through prostitutes that prolong the cycle. So this idea that that grown men are passing on STIs to the young women. Those young women are then passing them on to their newborn children. Those newborn children, if they grow up to be prostitutes, will pass it back down again. So this idea that the suffering cycle is never ever going to end. We're going to have a constant cycle of suffering unless they break free of these mind-forged manacles and stand up for what they think is right. Now, finally, the poem ends with blights were plagues, the marriage hearse. So here, the illnesses and diseases were rife due to living conditions. So these plagues, there's lots and lots of diseases on the streets of London. They were very, very packed. You've got the prostitutes, you've got STIs. It just wasn't a very clean and nice place to be living in. Suggesting that the poor people are powerless to protect themselves. The youth are being robbed of their health and lives. They're marrying earlier, they're dying earlier because the government are not being there to protect them. Now, the second group of quotations you could discuss are quotations to do with injustice. So you've got some just potentially some different ideas on the quotations for suffering, maybe something slightly different to what your teacher has taught you, but the more ideas that you've got, the better. The more interpretations for the quotation, the better. Now, for injustice, you have got the two corporations, two people, organisations, that William Blake believes are responsible for the injustice in London. So you've got the Blackening Church. So this idea that the church is corrupt and doesn't provide charity or share its wealth in the way that it should. It uses the wealth for its own gain. So, for example, the chimney sweepers, they use the child chimney sweepers for its own gain rather than to protect them. Blake, as we saw from the context at the start, holds institutions like the church responsible for not ending the suffering. They have a brilliant platform to end the suffering. They are supposed to be there to protect, yet they are the blackening church, to suggest that they're not ending that suffering. And this idea, this repetition of again, that it's not just one church that is corrupt. All of the churches in London are corrupt. They're not helping. You could also, on the flip side, then talk about the reference. This could also be a reference to the impact of the Industrial Revolution upon the city. So this idea that the blackening church, this idea that everything is dirty and polluted because of the factory smoke. So you could talk about that very, very obvious reference, but this idea that it's a blackening church is more in line with this idea that the church are not being responsible for protecting those younger children that it should be protecting. And then finally, you've got this idea of runs in blood down palace walls. So this idea that the palace is behind the walls, the palace is protected, the palace is oblivious to the suffering that it's imposing onto the poor people. Blake believes powerless people are left to suffer whilst those in the palace protect themselves behind the walls. They link into this idea that the government and the monarchy put in rules to protect themselves. They are protected behind these walls. And the soldiers are protecting a monarchy with which they don't agree with. So you've got this idea that the hapless soldiers sigh and the blood runs in blood down palace walls. This idea that the soldier has gone away to protect his country, but he comes back and he doesn't agree with what his country is doing anymore. Therefore, he's feeling extremely hopeless. He is again in this never-ending cycle of suffering because of this palace, because of the monarchy that he thought he could trust. Now, in terms of form and structure, you've got an AB rhyme scheme, which is unbroken. Now, in terms of commenting on form and structure, I would try and link it with a language point that you are trying to make so that you're not just shoehorning any comments in. But you also need to say not only comment on the structure, but why that structure has been used. So this idea that it's an unbroken rhyme scheme, which could, number one, link to the footsteps, as he's travelling through London, but it also could echo the relentless misery of the city. It's very structured, just like the streets of London would be. There is no break in this cycle of misery as they're walking through the city. The second thing that you could talk about is the cyclical structure, so the fact that we start and end with the suffering. You could say that every day is the same. It's a repetitive cycle of misery, poverty, and death. And therefore you can link it to Blake's message that unless the chains are broken, we will continue the never-ending cycle of misery. So this idea that Blake does get frustrated with the people of London and that they don't break free of those mind-forged manacles, and he's suggesting that unless they do break free of those manacles, they're never going to end that cycle of misery and suffering, because the rich are there to look after themselves, the poor have got each other, but if the poor are not willing to stand up to the rich and the tyranny imposed by the rich, then they are never ever going to break that cycle of suffering. As I said to you before, there may be some new ideas that we've touched upon. The aim of that revision session is just to remind you very briefly on what the poem is about, and just give you some extra ideas that you can add to your own notes just to push it a little bit further.